While people are trickling in, I was curious to know how most of you heard about this lecture. This is an amazing turnout. How many of you heard about it through the normal? How many of you heard about it through any of our newspapers? Oh, that's good to know. And how many of you heard about it through friends? Okay. What about through the History Museum? I think they promoted it as well. Excellent. Okay. Well, this is certainly a successful turnout. While people are settling in, I will just start with a few brief opening remarks. My name is Mercy Davison. I am the planner for the town of Normal, and I've been here for about 15 years. Can everyone in the back hear okay? Okay, excellent. I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture in the town of Normal's 150th anniversary lecture series. Oh, I'm cutting out. Okay, but this is not the mic that Dr. Holsinger will be using. First, some housekeeping. For those of you who are new to this building, how many of you are here for the first time? Oh, that's a good chunk of people. Okay, so for some housekeeping, the restrooms are just out the back doors and down to the left. There's a water fountain and everything. Also, were there to be an emergency, there are staircases at that end of the hallway and then around to this side of the hallway. Second, if you've never taken a chance, what is this, Wayne? Is it when it's too close, too far? Hold it closer. It's when I turn. Okay, I'll be like a robot. I will not turn. Can I have your... Okay, so yeah, this is great. This building is full of art that was made by all local artists. I would encourage you to look around the fourth floor today and appreciate all of the art, including down the hallway. If you come back during business hours during the week, you're welcome to roam through the whole building and look at all of the art. There's beautiful art on all the floors. The fourth floor is typically locked, but don't be discouraged. Just go to the second floor to the town clerk, and she'll give you a swipe card so you can get in here. We have people come into this building every week just to look at the art. It's really, really wonderful. The third thing is that as part of our 150th celebration, we have lots of very nice merchandise for sale outside of the doors here, including this lovely clown t-shirt, Greatest Town on Earth, that I am wearing, and a few others, and some really nice trivets and coasters and ornaments. It's some really nice stuff. We'll be selling this throughout the next few weeks at a lot of events. And finally, please consider coming to our other events, including this lecture series, but we also have a lot of events happening on the weekend of September 11th through the 13th. On the 11th, we'll be showing Greatest Show on Earth, and preceding that, we'll have some remarks by Bobby Horton Thoreau, whose father, Pop Horton, is the Horton Fieldhouse fella, and he started the Gamma Phi Circus at ISU, so we're doing a lot to celebrate our town's circus history. That's on Friday the 11th. On Saturday, we'll have a lot of circus activities in Uptown Normal, including the Flying Walendas, which is pretty exciting. And then Sunday, we'll be having a history fair at the Carol Reitan Conference Center in Uptown, along with historic portrayals and some storytelling put together by Illinois Voices and the Twin City Tailspinners. So keep an eye out for those activities. They're going to be a lot of fun, and we really appreciate, clearly, you're interested in our history, so there will be more coming. But now, let me introduce today's lecturer, Paul Holsinger, who I didn't suspect I'd be buddying up with up here. Paul is chair and professor of history emeritus from Illinois State University, where he taught from 1969 through 2003. For many years, Dr. Holsinger also offered, through the Bloomington Normal Adult Education Program, a free course in local McLean County history, which was open to the entire community, anyone who wanted to attend, and for more than 20 years, hundreds of people did just that. At the same time, he developed at ISU both graduate and undergraduate courses in local history and taught them both until he retired. He's also written a book back in 2000. He wrote this for the Association of Commerce and Industry to celebrate its 100th birthday, and that book is called Building a Greater Community, A History. And that is still one of the better and easier to find texts about the 20th century history of our community, Bloomington and Normal. And I'd just like to personally thank Dr. Holsinger on behalf of all of the people at the town who are working on these activities. He's put a lot of hours into researching and writing his remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing his lecture entitled "The Past is Indeed Prologue, Normal, Illinois, the Early Years, 1853 to 1967. Dr. Holsinger.
Okay. Mercy said this makes it sound like the voice of God. Can you all hear the voice of God speaking to you? Okay. I think I would, sort of as a caveat, I would much rather stand up here and just kind of ad lib. But if I did that, we'd probably still be here tomorrow morning, and I don't think most of you want that. So I'm going to try to read this and hope that it makes sense to all of you. And then afterwards, if you have any questions, I don't know that I can answer them, but I'll do my best. One other thought. In trying to cover 100 plus years of history in an hour or so is kind of difficult. I'm going to be skimming through a lot of things. Some of you may say, how could he have left that out? For instance, we just mentioned Pop Horton and Gamma Phi Circus. That's not in here. And I got to thinking, why did I leave that out? And then I thought, I know why I left it out, because there's too many things to say. Still, I hope I've hit the highlights. As far as the eye could see, there was seemingly endless prairie. The area where the bustling town of Normal now sits was, until at least the mid-1850s, empty of anything that could be described today as civilization. There were no businesses, no homes, no roads, and certainly no residents of any kind. Even though the small but growing city of Bloomington lay little more than 2 miles to the south, anyone who ventured north found only miles and miles of grassland, which, in the words of Ambassador James Ewing many years later, quote, waved and undulated like a sea in motion. It was, he said, an endless landscape of grasses and flowers, where the wild rose bloomed and the red deer wandered. Though like Ewing, there were at least a few people who admired the natural beauty of the land. He called the area far more wonderful than Bloomington with its many trees. Almost no one seemed to have imagined that it might ever have any material value. When Bloomington's first lawyer, Jesse Fell, on his way on horseback to the small pioneering community on Money Creek, in the spring of 1833, stopped on the hill where he was later to build the family home, he was immediately impressed. He expressed the idea that the land had much potential and that it would make a perfect location for a future town. But when he told some friends that idea, they quickly rebuffed him. No one in his right mind, they said, would want to consider living on land located so far away from timber, such as Bloomington's many groves of trees. Though to be sure, after 1835, there were a number of real estate speculators, including the young David Davis, who did purchase blocks of land that ultimately became the heart of today's Normal. No one made any effort to move to those properties, content with simply holding on to the titles just in case the land ever did become valuable and they could sell it at a profit. It was not until 1853 that the first home of any sort was built in today's Normal. During that summer, both the Illinois Central and then the Chicago and Mississippi, later to be called the Chicago and Alton, railroads arrived in the area. Their tracks, thanks to a good deal of political machinations on the part of local representatives to the General Assembly, crossing at what became known as the Junction, big capital letters and all the rest, which was located just a few feet from where we're meeting this afternoon. A small and quite crude train station was established, and to house the new station master, William McCambridge, and his growing family, quote, a quite roomy 3-room house made of rough timbers, unplaned planks, and a shingle roof, to quote McCambridge's son years later, was constructed. By this time, there were a few farmers also scattered around the area, though none of them showed little interest in creating a town of any sort. Of far more concern to most of these men was the value of the land as a place for raising nursery stock. Robert Fell, One of Jesse's younger brothers, for instance, had in the early 1850s laid out a small nursery within the area that was to become normal. Though he sold that small 10-acre property to a recent transplant from Wisconsin named Franklin Phoenix several years later, and though the growth of what was to be eventually called the Phoenix Nursery was slow at first, it soon started growing at a speed that few could imagine. By the end of the Civil War, it had, at well over 1,000 acres, become the nation's second largest nursery. Seeing its success, dozens of other men were soon developing farms of their own on the black, rich soil of the area. The first steps toward actually creating a town in the heart of the prairie came in June of 1854. Jesse Fell and 4 of his business associates, R.R. Landon, L.R. Case, C.W. Holden, and L.C. Blakesley, marked off 200 parcels of land in what was to the heart of today's Normal, and they offered them for sale at prices ranging from $30 to $50 apiece. They dubbed that paper town North Bloomington, and though few of the parcels sold, and then only to land speculators, the wheels were set in motion for the creation of what is today's Normal. Everybody knew that the prime mover in the project was Fell. Only he made any attempt to build on the land, but determined to make the new town appealing for all, he laid out a number of streets and then set out almost immediately to plant literally thousands of trees on them. True to his Quaker upbringing, he also decided that his new town must be liquor-free so that it could become, quote, the most thoroughly temperance town in the state of Illinois, unquote. In doing so, he dreamed of creating, again a quote, a desirable abiding place where the existence of a saloon or a grog shop within its limits would be a matter of impossibility. No doggeries were to be tolerated, he wrote. Indeed, not even a bowling alley was to be built. True to his commitment to the new town, Fell began the following year to construct what would for years be Normal's grandest residence. Located on roughly 15 acres of land just to the south of the Chicago and Alton tracks off of today's Broadway Avenue, this property, after its completion in 1856, became known to one and all as Greenwood, or sometimes simply Fell Park, which of course should not be confused with today's park by that same name. For the next 30 years after his death in 1887, the Fell home became the center of the town's social life. Fell, the consummate real estate developer, realized, of course, that no town could ever hope to succeed unless it contained something of value, a major business, a university, an agricultural hub. In his case, Fell had long dreamed of living in a town that was an educational center. From the moment that he turned the first spade of dirt for the foundation of his home on today's Broadway Avenue, and long before he was able to help persuade the state of Illinois to locate its first public university in the area, he was trying to find a way to bring a college or perhaps a seminary to land near his new home. He even went so far as to contact the famous Massachusetts educator Horace Mann, hoping to persuade him to come to McLean County and establish an ideal school that would incorporate all of Mann's forward-thinking ideas. That, of course, did not happen, but short-term failure never deterred Jesse Fell from pressing on. He longed for the day when he would somehow manage to have a truly great university come to his never-incorporated town of North Bloomington. The first part of that dream was not long in coming. On February the 18th, 1857, the Illinois General Assembly, years after other neighboring states had created public universities of their own, and after even more years of arguing among themselves whether tax money ought to be used for public education, finally voted to establish a so-called normal university, where future teachers of the state could be trained in the most advanced techniques of the day. Being Illinois politicians, of course, those men determined that they would place the new institution in whatever town offered them the most money. Such an opening was too much for Fell to ignore. Immediately, he pledged some of his own considerable fortune, while at the same time rounding up pledges from friends and associates. He was determined that no city would be able to outbid the Bloomington area, and in reality, his North Bloomington. Though it took a good deal of legal and financial maneuvering, Fell, before he was finished, managed to accumulate the then grand total of $141,725. Only Peoria came close, and its leaders were unable to top the $80,000 mark for their bid. The fact that Jesse Fell had engineered a successful campaign to bring the new university to McLean County, of course, in no way guaranteed that the state would choose North Bloomington as the site for the new school. There were, in fact, 6 different sites under consideration in the North Bloomington area when the members of the new State Board of Education arrived in Bloomington on May the 3rd, 1857, to select the best location on which to build. The following day, a day which the Bloomington Panagraph noted was, quote, exceedingly unpleasant, a strong raw wind blowing with rain falling at intervals. The men made their way to the various sites. As they did so, on several occasions, getting stuck in the muddy prairie soil. Though there was no unanimity among the trustees, Kersey Fell, Jesse's brother, had, for instance, offered a 30-acre plot on Sugar Creek. In the end, they settled on a piece of land near the junction, land that Jesse had specifically plotted. Several days later, the board, after checking one last time on Peoria's possibilities, voted to accept the North Bloomington site with its 160 acres of free land, 60 of which were located just east of what would be an extended Main Street coming north from Bloomington. The Panagraph was pleased with that choice. The land, the paper's editor noted, rises on a beautiful swell with several small knolls at the summit on which a building can be placed. North, east, west of the site was, quote, a broad expanse of rich and beautiful prairie, which rolls away for several miles, much of it still wearing the robes of prairie grass which clothed it on creation morning. The view from the summit will be, the Panagraph averred, one of the most extensive and beautiful inland views in the entire world. From that moment on, the history of Normal, as everyone soon was calling the new university, and the town, which within a short time began to grow around it, were to be inextricably linked. The cornerstone of the new university was laid in late August 1857, with, one might add, much fanfare and a considerable amount of religious fervor. Prayers were said asking God to bless the new enterprise, and a Bible was even inserted into the cornerstone to demonstrate to one and all that this new school was to be a center for morality and good works. By that time, several houses beside that of the Fells had already been erected. Others were under construction. Many of the shade trees that Jesse Fell had planted were growing rapidly, and the Panagraph's editor said the town would soon be, quote, one of the prettiest little towns in the West. Nearly everybody was impressed, and possibly all, by Jesse Fell's continuing devotion to tree planting, which continued unabated even after the new university was begun. Though the Normal Town Council noted in 1857, at the time of his death, that, quote, Normal without Jesse Fell is comparatively like a family without a father. And though his life was inextricably connected with the entire area in so many ways, from being one of the most important boosters of Abraham Lincoln to founding what was ultimately to be the area's first newspaper, locals of the day always saw him first and foremost as a planter of trees. At his own expense, he paid the soon-to-be famous landscape architecture Richard Saunders, the future designer of the grounds of the U.S. Capitol, or of 1876's Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, to lay out the grounds surrounding Old Main. Fell soon set himself the task of personally planting the campus, and before he finished, more than 1,800 ornamental trees were in place. And he never stopped. Before he died, Fell had planted more than 38,000 trees, virtually every type, evergreens, annuals, ornamental shrubs, throughout the entire Midwest, 15,000 or more of them in today's Normal itself. His fame soon spread far and wide. In the mid-1870s, for instance, when a young co-ed at the university asked her professor, quite seriously, whether he thought there'd be trees in heaven, his response summed up the beliefs of almost all of Central Illinois. "I don't know," he said, "but if Jesse Fell gets there first and finds none, he's going to hunt around and find some somewhere and he'll plant them." The Pantograph championed that thought. In a praiseworthy article about him in one of the 1865 editions, its editor said that Fell needed to be honored not only for bringing, quote, unrivaled educational facilities to the area, but also for his systematic attention to ornamental tree planting. Between 1857 and 1860, when the university's one and only building, Old Main, as people soon called it, was finally completed, about 20 families had moved into the area, most to homes within view of the building itself. There was, however, nothing that resembled town. Though a few maps continued to place the school and its neighbors in North Bloomington, no city by that name had ever been incorporated or chartered. On the contrary, when the county laid out township lines in 1858, local residents whose homes or farms surrounded the Normal had overwhelmingly decided, for obvious reasons, to call their township Normal. There were other suggestions. Rustic or rural were put forth as alternative designations, but Normal it became, and Normal it has remained till today. Creating a township, however, was in no way the same as creating a town. It was indeed to be almost another decade before the idea of organizing an actual town took shape. Though most of the homes closer to the school, and even a business or two located near the junction, were in the area because of the state university, the great majority of residents in the area were far more interested in agriculture than in teaching teachers. Nurseries continued to abound. By 1859, more than 1,000 owner-operated acres, some within easy sight of the ISNU campus, were under cultivation. Fruit trees were specifically a specialty, but raspberries, blackberries, or other small fruits were grown in other areas. Franklin Phoenix, Cyrus Overman, W.H. Mann, even Charles E. Fell, one of Jesse's many nephews, founded and expanded their businesses within the limits of what is today's town. Within a few years, Henry Augustine, who was to become one of America's most renowned horticulturalists, also joined that group. By 1860, the federal census claimed that there were 847 people living in the Normal area, though clearly the huge majority of them were residents in Normal Township rather than anything resembling today's town. With the opening of Old Main that spring, however, more and more people began to relocate to the area near the university grounds, and it became clear that sooner or later they would need to formalize an actual town in which to live. By this time, everyone seemed to have agreed that when it finally did come, the town could have no other name but Normal. Indeed, even the federal government gave its official approval. The following year, in June of 1861, it officially established a post office for the area and called it Normal. Jesse Fell was selected to be the town's first postmaster. In April of that same year, of course, the war between the states had begun. The Normal, as everyone was dubbing the school, had grown steadily, but now, just as quickly, it almost disappeared. Its president, Charles Hovey, had for months been training all the university's male students in military tactics, marching them in close order drill back and forth on land at today's intersection of Mulberry and College Avenue, arming them with tree branches for guns. Now, immediately after the first battle at Bull Run in July, Hovey resigned to form his own Union Army unit, the Illinois 33rd, or as it became better known, the Teachers Regiment. Soon, every able-bodied male in the entire school had marched off to battle as well. The devastation of war was felt throughout the area almost at once. One of the first men to leave for the war, amid much fanfare, had been the principal of ISNU's model school, Joseph Howe. A year later, all the university's remaining students, and a good many townsfolk as well, stood in silence at the train station as his body was brought back from Fort Donelson, where he'd been killed fighting under Ulysses Grant. Many others were to die in the ensuing years. The home front, however, benefited greatly from the war. What was officially to become normal in 1865 at the war's end grew by proverbial leaps and bounds. New homes, some for the faculty of the university, some to provide boarding rooms for the students, still others to house the many businessmen who were coming to town, were rapidly erected. Though downtown, or I guess we should say now uptown, consisted of little more than a few stores located near the junction on such streets as the all-important Buford Street, they too quickly grew. Soon numerous families, anxious to raise their children in, as the pantograph said, the most moral and best behaved community in the state of Illinois, were coming in larger and larger numbers each year. When Hovey, now a colonel in the Army, arrived back in town on a furlough in 1864, it was said that he didn't recognize the area, and after getting off the train, almost reboarded it again. Though it had nothing to do with the war itself, one of the most important things to occur in the early 1860s was the first actual linking of the area around Old Main with the growing city of Bloomington. Before there were enough boarding facilities for the many remaining female students left on campus, almost all of them lived in Bloomington, and each day they were forced to walk the miles across the prairie through the constant dirt and mud. Some finally had enough. In 1862, they raised money, got several businesses to donate lumber, and in the early part of that year, with the help of any number of men who were still in the area, had a narrow plank sidewalk built to link Bloomington with the university. That was the first time that they two had ever been physically joined. Though that walkway didn't last very long, the area was here to stay. Almost everybody agreed that linking the two cities was a good idea. By the time that the war ended, it was possible to walk from the southern boundary of Bloomington all the way to the university grounds and beyond on paved sidewalk. Although a number of people, including Jesse Fell for a while, had suggested that eventually Bloomington and the community surrounding the Normal might become one large metropolis, it soon became clear that two separate cities had little in common. Bloomington was a commercial center with a tiny, and at that time quite undistinguished university run by the Methodist Church. Its counterpart in the north was, on the contrary, the center of all state-supported advanced learning in the state. It was already gaining fame throughout the Midwest with little seeming interest in commercialization, and that distinction continued to grow. In the fall of 1864, thanks in large part once again to Jesse Fell, voters in the area, swelled by the many Union Army troops who were on furlough, passed a memorial calling on the state to establish a home for the many orphans of Illinois soldiers who died and were dying on the battlefields of the war. In February the following year, the legislature approved the idea, and immediately Fell set out, as he had 8 years earlier, to raise enough money and/or land in pledges to convince the state that the home should be located close to his university. Once again, he was successful, though it took until May of 1867 before the so-called Illinois Soldiers' Orphans Home was started on land located east of the university, and until 1869 before the site was dedicated. The future town had yet another reason to congratulate itself. The story of what was eventually to be called ISSCS, the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School, is a fascinating one that my colleague Ruth Cobb will be discussing in far more detail next week in the Community Activity Center on that school's former campus. Hopefully many of you will be there to listen. When the war came to an end, there were roughly 350 people living within what was to become the town's future boundaries. At the same time, there were probably another 1,650 living in the surrounding Normal Township. A community that large, it was reasoned, called for the creation of a town, and many leaders, including the editor of the Pantograph, began a campaign to do just that. On the 18th of September, 1865, it was the day that was selected for the town-wide meeting to consider whether to incorporate the town of Normal or not. When that day arrived, only 37 men bothered to show up, but after minimal discussion, they voted unanimously in favor of the idea. 2 weeks later, on the 30th of September, a second election. This one to choose 5 trustees to run the new town was held. And this time, only 11 people came. But 5 men were nominated. Each received a unanimous 11-0 vote. Though he was in favor of incorporation, Jesse Fell remained insistent that he did not want any town unless it would be prohibitionist in its atmosphere. With the help of ISNU's new president since 1862, Richard Edwards, he began to circulate petitions asking every resident of the new town to pledge their dedication to making the town perpetually dry, in contrast to the very wet Bloomington with its dozens of saloons. Everybody agreed. Supposedly, every man, woman, and child over the age of 6, including all the students of the Normal, signed the petition, and it, along with a formal vote on incorporation, was forwarded to the General Assembly in Springfield for its approval. That group, in turn, approved the town's new charter on February the 16th, 1866. All mention of North Bloomington now completely disappeared. Normal became the town's official designated name. The creation of Normal 150 years ago involved far more than just legal incorporation, however. One of the most vital steps was the establishment of churches in which to worship. From the moment that Old Main had been opened in 1860, local Protestant congregants had attended interdenominationally church services every Sunday in that building's main auditorium. Now, with war's end, numerous individual religious denominations moved to create their own church buildings. In the spring of 1865, the Congregationists organized first. Several months later, the Methodists followed suit when 23 members met at the home of A.E. Mason on North Street to form Normal's First Methodist Church. Within a year or two, the Baptists and Presbyterians had created separate churches of their own, and the Disciples of Christ were not very far behind. Everything seemed to be working well for the new town. The Pantograph in the fall of 1865 noted that the growth of Normal was, quote, still alive and lively as ever. A new house is begun almost every day, and one day last week, 4 lots were sold west of the university grounds in parties intending to build on them immediately. Land was cleared, new additions were laid out almost every month. More than 25 new homes were built in the next 6 months. Normal, the Pantograph's editor added in another edition, will soon be the prettiest village in the country. Though the new town of Normal was tiny in population, its name spread far and wide over the next decade or two. There were 3 entirely different reasons for this. In 1866, Richard Edwards wrote and published the first of his analytical readers, designed to teach students in the public schools across America how to read, write, and hopefully think. Extremely moralistic. Edwards, besides being the university president, was also an ordained minister who frequently preached throughout central Illinois on the weekends. The eventual 7 different levels of readers began selling immediately like proverbial hotcakes. Adopted by school districts all over the country, including New York and Chicago, Edwards' books, with more than 80,000 volumes in circulation, soon were outselling every other text that was similar in nature. They continued to be bestsellers into the early years of the 20th century. Now, to be sure, many students probably could have cared less about the where of the books they were forced to read. But scholars everywhere saw Normal, Illinois on the title pages, and they could not have helped but be impressed. A year later, in 1867, Wesley Powell, along with several university students and a Normalite or two, set out to explore the far west. That journey, and a subsequent one which saw Powell and his entourage become the first white man to conquer the Colorado River, especially through the Grand Canyon, was the kind of voyage that captured the imagination of Americans everywhere. Powell was not long for Normal or Central Illinois after his second adventure. Offered a job at Washington, D.C. Smithsonian Institute, he left Illinois never to return. Certainly, however, there were few people in the late 1860s who did not know the name Normal because of Powell's growing fame. Perhaps even more important, however, in advancing Normal's reputation after the Civil War was a decision on the part of Elias Dillon and his nephews Isaiah and Levi to move to Normal in 1866. Even before they arrived, the three men started importing and breeding the huge so-called Norman horses from Europe that still fascinate us whenever an advertisement for Budweiser features that company's beautiful Percherons. Once on the new property, located in part where David Anderson Park stands today, the Dillons rapidly expanded to become one of the largest firms anywhere in America who dealt with these big animals. Over the next 2+ decades, the Dillons brought dozens of the giant horses via boat and then train to Normal. They became crowd pleasers virtually everywhere, and tens of thousands of people from New York City to Central Illinois left work or school to go see them whenever a train in which they were being shipped might stop. Once in Normal, the horses were bred and then on an accelerated schedule sold in large sales which brought buyers to Normal from virtually every city or small town in America. Though Elias Dillon retired from the firm in 1883, his nephews continued the business through the rest of the century, building as they did a number of huge barns located in town where the horses could be displayed. Normal in the latter part of the 19th century was a town which, though small, was rapidly becoming a balanced shopping center for the immediate local area. In the mid-1870s, for instance, as ISNU expanded, so too did Normal, seemingly in an attempt to emulate, on a smaller scale, its neighbor to the south. According to the city directory of 1873, for instance, there was a baker, a barber, 2 blacksmiths, a shoemaker, 2 dressmakers, a druggist, 2 dry goods stores, a grain dealership, 4 different grocery stores, a hardware store, 2 hotels, 3 meat markets, several music teachers, 5 physicians, and on and on. There were, on the other hand, no lawyers, no banks, and certainly, in contrast to Bloomington's 28 different ones, no saloons or establishments selling liquor of any kind. There were also no houses of ill repute, to use the polite term that was used to describe the many brothels with their ladies of the night, which Bloomington had in abundance. Indeed, Bloomington, for the next half century, had one of the Midwest's most renowned small-town red light districts. Pure and ostensible, moral Normal certainly did not. Despite the successful growth of the town, or perhaps because of it, it was not long before business leaders were looking for an even better way of linking the twin cities together. In 1868, a number of local entrepreneurs, including the ubiquitous Jesse Fell, one might add who else, founded what they called the Bloomington and Normal Horse Railway Company. In an attempt to make access between the two cities easier than ever, the men had tracks laid between Bloomington and the junction in Normal and started running a streetcar throughout the day and early evening between the two towns. For a one-way fare of only 10 cents, passengers could leave the railroad depot near Linden Avenue in Normal, go up North Street to the ISNU grounds, then up Franklin Avenue to Bloomington's South Main Street, where they could shop and see a play, attend a stage presentation, or even go to work in any of the number of businesses in the big city. Though the cars only held 12 passengers at a time, and without any heating were bitter cold in the wintertime, the 30-minute ride still made Normal a viable place to live, especially for those who wished to escape what many considered the sinfulness of the larger city of Bloomington. Normal was, in its earliest years, unquestionably a predominantly WASP, that is, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant community. Though certainly there were no restrictive covenants or other laws that forbade Roman Catholics or Jews from settling in the new town, few did, most choosing to stay in Bloomington where they could readily get a good strong drink whenever they wished it, rather than moving north to Normal. It's impossible to say today just how important those divisions in religious belief impacted on the two communities, but certainly one of the most obvious was the decision just before the turn of the 20th century to create not one, but 2 separate hospitals in the community. One Roman Catholic run, St. Joseph's on Bloomington's west side, and the other Protestant operated in nearby Normal. St. Joseph's had been created in 1880 when Catholic nuns from the predominantly German order of St. Francis had canvassed the immigrant areas of Bloomington to get enough money to found it. Open to everyone, Catholic and Protestant alike, the new hospital was a success from the start. But sadly, there were in both cities, especially in Normal, many non-Catholics who found it hard to be nursed by nuns. In 1893, then, it didn't seem strange when doctors, both from Normal and Bloomington, began to raise money to build a uniquely Protestant hospital. Pledges were made, and though it took several years before the necessary funds were raised, the doctors were successful. And within the year, they'd located a new hospital building just inside the southern boundary of Normal. The founders initially turned the running of the new hospital over to the local Mennonite deaconesses. When that group bowed out, believing they said the doctors were getting more credit than God for healing that was taking place, a transfer was made to the women of the Methodist Episcopal Church. For the next 5 years, the Methodist Deaconess Hospital created a permanent base in Normal in competition with the Catholic St. Joseph's. To keep it growing, Abram Brokaw, a dedicated Protestant and one of the area's richest men, in 1901 donated thousands of dollars to the deaconesses. In his honor, they readily changed their name to Brokaw Hospital. Though there have been many changes, including several name alterations since, the Protestant hospital remains on the same site it was located so many years earlier. A similar division among the people of Normal also existed racially. The African American story, which my colleague Mark Wyman will explain in far more detail several weeks from now, is, however, far less clear. The last years of the 19th century, especially with their expansion of the many nurseries, brought more and more black families, usually from the Upper South, to town to work and live. The Pantograph, for instance, in April the 14th, 1884, reported that 21 different black families, all of them from Kentucky, had come in a group to settle in town. At a time when race was perhaps the greatest divider of people, Normal unquestionably had a disproportionately large number of African American residents. They started churches of their own, built new homes, and though informally segregated more by money than by the color of their skin, the black community thrived. Was it Jesse Fell's plan to make Normal a refuge for African Americans? Some suggest that that was exactly the case, particularly after the end of the Civil War, but others are not so sure. One thing is, however, clear. Fell was a strong proponent of integrated schools, and he never waned in his desire to make admission to the public schools colorblind. In the spring of 1867, for instance, he led the way in successfully allowing a, quote, colored girl, unquote, to enroll at ISNU's model school. He'd helped to create Normal, he said, to be, in his words, a town distinguished no less for its schools than for its devotion to human rights. Though some residents of the new town were bitterly opposed to the idea of racial equality, Normal voters, spurred on by Fell, went to the polls that April and overwhelmingly voted for complete integration of the town's schools. That particular vote drew the ire of some of the Democratic newspapers, particularly in Chicago, where one said, "Normal is a hotbed of abolitionism run wild." Such, of course, was not the case, despite the vote. No matter how many good intentions some residents thought they had, there were few who were willing to dismiss racial differences altogether. Normal school administrators, for instance, year after year, always were careful to note in their annual reports the number of, quote, colored children they had in the schools as opposed to those who were white. If Jesse Fell's dreams of turning Normal into one of America's most unique small towns often succeeded, there were, of course, needless to say, times when he failed spectacularly. In 1868, for example, after Congress had appropriated federal monies for the establishment of universities in each state that would specialize in agriculture and the industrial arts, Fell immediately set out to bring Illinois' newest university to Normal, in the same way that 11 years earlier he'd helped to bring ISNU here. Though proud of the Normal, Fell had always wanted his town to be a home for a full-ranging university and not just a teacher's college. He set to raising money once again to bring the new university to Normal. It was almost an act of love. But this time, he struck out completely. Though he was able once again to raise more money than any other community in the state, he could not overcome the political, under-the-table deals that were soon swirling everywhere. And to his dismay, he was forced to watch as the state awarded the new school not to Normal, but to the small village of Urbana. But Jesse Fell was the quintessential booster. Failure never seemed to have deterred him from always seeking yet another plum for Normal. On the heels of his successful venture to bring the orphans home here, he also put in a bid to locate the state industrial reform school. Once again, he failed. That school went to Pontiac instead and was later transformed into the state's most important prison facility. But Fell never stopped. He also attempted to lure the Eastern Illinois Insane Asylum to town, but he was given to Kankakee. A home for the feeble-minded also seemed feasible. It's hard to imagine what Normal would look like today had Fell succeeded in his quest. Town folks could have enjoyed the students and their activities at the monstrously large University of Illinois/Illinois State University Combine, while they worried constantly about the prisoners behind the huge walls that loomed over Linden Avenue, were solicitous about the mentally disabled inmates at the insane asylum, and who knows what they would felt in regard to the feeble-minded. But it would have been interesting. But it was not just state-funded projects that caught Fell's attention. While he seriously believed that Normal could ever become a major center for agriculture or not, or for manufacture or not, he and other local business associates were always trying to transform the town into something bigger and better. Several different iron foundries, one founded by Fell himself, were built in the early years in the town, as was a woolen mill, a large paper mill, a factory manufacturing horse collars, and several canning factories, all of which ultimately failed. So too did a large stockyard built close to the C&A depot. During the early days, residents of Normal seemed to have had an aversion to being taxed for just about anything. I will not comment on today. Nearly every public works project that was proposed failed for lack of money to fund it. It was not until 1892, for instance, that any street in the town was paved. And then it was only a small section of Buford near Linden. The 100 block of North Street got the same treatment the following year. But that was it for nearly the next 20 years. When the rains of spring and fall arrived, Normal, in the words of one local historian, quote, floundered in the mud. Though there was one paid policeman, residents adamantly refused to fund a professional fire department until well into the mid-20th century, which resulted in fires which burned significant portions of the buildings in town again and again. As late as the 1890s, volunteers were forced to use totally inadequate materials to fight the town's many conflagrations. The town's firefighting equipment consisted of one used and antiquated hand engine, which the pantograph said, quote, in palmy days might have served to wash second-floor windows, sprinkle lawns, or maybe empty a cistern. But for fire purposes, it was absolutely useless. It was, the paper concluded, quote, a wheezy, barnacle-bottomed, balking monstrosity, which during fires such as the big one, which devastated a good part of the town business district in 1890, quote, positively refused to even take on water, much less throw it out of the nozzle. Even when the town fathers did, in a spirit of forward thinking, decide on improvements, all too often their best intentions failed miserably. In 1877, for example, they erected gas lights throughout the business section of town, and an official lamplighter was hired. Within 5 years, however, bereft of money, the lamplighter's job was written out of the budget and all the lights were torn down. The town, according to the pantograph, was left, quote, to smother in darkness. A similar situation occurred a few years later. The town council, having had a change of heart, installed electric art lamps in downtown. Within a year, unwilling to raise the taxes to pay for them, they found themselves without money even to pay for the carbons necessary to light them. Once again, shoppers were left, quote, to pick their way through the mud and the water of our streets in relative darkness, unquote. So it's easy to blame the elected leaders for such backwardness. In truth, much of the problem came from the residents themselves. Everyone knew, for example, that the town needed an adequate water supply, but almost no one was willing, even when fires burned large sections of the town again and again, to raise the money to pay for it. Even when the majority of voters finally did approve the building of a municipal water system in 1898, 2 years after a huge fire in 1896 that had burned numerous buildings in downtown, as well as many of the town's original records, hundreds voted against the idea as being unnecessary. The same general malaise affected the town's one and only city park. Jesse Fell had deeded land to the town with the understanding that it be transformed into a park. And for years on end, the land sat empty and unused, an eyesore to everyone. Unwilling to ask residents to pay money for the park's upkeep, the town fathers instead, for many years, rented out the land, first to farmers to pasture their cattle, and then, after the turn of the new century, to the Central Illinois Holiness Association as a site for their summer camps or revivals. It was no accident that the land on which was supposed to be a pristine playground was chosen in 1898 to place a large standpipe for the town's water system there. Not until the early 1920s, after complete overhauling of the town's financial system, did the parkland become a center for recreational activities that Fell had intended it to be. For all of its problems, and there were many more than are mentioned here today, including the lack of an adequate sanitary sewer system, Normal still boasted itself as the ideal residential city, unquote. A scan of the pages of the pantograph throughout the town's first 50 years reveals a community that was always family-oriented. There might be no bowling alleys or theaters, but there was a large roller skating rink which drew young people night after night. In the winter, Broadway Hill, from today's Vernon Avenue all the way into downtown Normal, was allowed to ice over, and the entire town turned out to sled on it, often going 30 miles an hour or faster as they passed over the railroad tracks, and feeling like one was riding the wave in the Atlantic, as one reporter noted. While he was alive, Jesse Fell and his wife Hester frequently opened their home to host town events. Every Sunday, the 15-acre ground surrounding the home was also always open to the public, who readily strolled through the trees, saw the tame deer and peacocks that were a part of the local, what residents began to call Deer Park. And if this wasn't enough, there always seemed to be something going on in the large auditorium at the Normal, which was the area's biggest, and there was something in which the town was always invited. Whether they were simply unable to handle the town's finances, or whether they just failed to carry out the mandate of the men who elected them, nearly all the town councils, year after year, failed miserably to put the town on a sound financial footing. By the beginning of the 20th century, there had been, as Jacob Hasbrook, an editor of the Pantograph, said in 1924, quote, many years of loose financing in which year after year the expenditures were far greater than the income. Every council knew the town desperately needed more pavements or sewers, or even something as necessary as better schools, but year after year they failed to provide them. By 1907, things had reached such a state that no matter how many times one repeated the words, great family town, every sensible person understood that drastic change was needed. And it was then that a new group of reformers, calling themselves the Normal Improvement Association, was formed. They persuaded ISNU economics professor O.L. Manchester to run for mayor on a reform ticket dedicated to change. When he and they won in the following year's town election, rapid change followed. The town's debt, by that time far more than town taxes could bring in any given year, was quickly turned into bonds, which voters now approve by more than a 2-to-1 ratio. Many streets were paved, at last, and lights went up, it stayed up. New businesses were encouraged to relocate to town. Even a new newspaper, dubbed The Normalite, was founded to spread the reform message. Change suddenly was everywhere, or so it seemed. Probably no single change in the first decades of the 20th century was more symbolic, however, than the creation of Cedar Crest, the first large-scale planned neighborhood in the town of Normal's history. Though there had been well over 2 dozen different so-called additions to the town through the years, it was Bert Kuhn, a well-respected businessman, who set the stage for real systematic change. In 1912, Kuhn had purchased the Charles Fell Nursery in South Normal, and now, 2 years later, he proposed to divide those grounds into a self-contained community filled with winding streets and uniquely designated homes. A community that would mirror the then popular City Beautiful movement that was sweeping the United States and Europe. The first lots were sold on October the 14th, 1914, and construction of the houses began the following year. The 60 homes running up Fell Street, Clinton Place, Broadway Place, today's Hillcrest, all different looking and manufactured with various materials such as tile roofs or rough-faced cinder brick, changed the face of Normal. When the last was finished in 1923, not only did the area look different than the old Normal, but it encouraged an entirely new class of resident, middle-class professionals, doctors, lawyers, editor of the Pantograph, even longtime business owner from Bloomington, C.W. Clem, to move in. Almost as significant in signaling Normal's changing face was the creation, beginning in 1902, of what was to be called the Baby Fold, soon to be one of Illinois' most significant social welfare organizations. When she died, Nancy Mason, one of the founders, along with her husband of the Normal's Methodist Church, willed her home on North Avenue to the Methodist deaconesses. At first, those ladies decided to turn the house into a home for the retired members of their group. But then, in 1906, they took a 180-degree turn, transforming it instead into a home where some of the thousands of abandoned babies throughout the state, and there were literally many thousands who were simply left on street corners and thrown in trash cans and whatever, could be cared for and loved. A young deaconess, Nancy Randall by name, brought the first baby down from Chicago that year. And though, through the rest of the century, the home was frequently in dire financial straits, it persevered to become a leader in the reform of the ways that society chose to deal with its youngest members. For the first time in years, Normal residents also seemed voluntarily willing to tax themselves to bring about much-needed change. In 1916, for example, they approved, along with others throughout the county, monies to build a sanatorium to care for those who had contracted tuberculosis. 3 years later, they also voted even more money to develop a unified sanitary water district with a large sewer treatment plant. Before the turn of the century, such ideas would have been summarily defeated. The years after the end of World War I brought any number of major highlights for Normal. In 1919, for example, local businessmen purchased the home of A.W. Watson with its large land holdings at the corner of Linden Street and Jersey Avenue, and transformed that into Normal's first country club. The 9-hole Maplewood Country Club opened the next year. Though it first proved a lively addition to the town, offering residents a place for their entertainment throughout the Roaring '20s, the club never was able to compete with its two Bloomington rivals. With the advent of the Great Depression after 1929, it fell on hard times. Though it did last until 1939, when its directors finally failed financially, the club had, for one of the first times in the history of Normal, shown that there could be more to the town than just puritanical restrictions. In the summer of 1923, the McLean County 4-H Fair, soon to be one of the nation's largest such get-togethers, was held in Normal for the first time, and it continued to be in Normal until 1927, when it finally would move to Bloomington. Transportation issues also loomed large in the decade of the 20s. In 1923, what was known as Route 66 reached Normal, and a few years later, Highway 51, Main Street Extended, was also developed. In 1927, the now so-called Twin Cities also got their first airport, in, of all places, North Normal. During the next 7 years, it was expanded and modernized on several occasions, and even for a very short time, there were commercial flights into and out of the town. Sadly, like so many other good ideas, it failed. When a brand new airport was created in 1934, it was located not in Normal, but off Route 9 in Bloomington. These stories and many more will be discussed several weeks from now when Terry Rybert, who's sitting right up here in the front, and Mike Matika offer a full-ranging discussion on the roles of transportation of the history of Normal. The advent of Prohibition in 1920 and its years in practice until 1933 caused no upheaval in Normal, as it was almost certainly did in the now suddenly dry Bloomington. Indeed, the grand experiment, as Herbert Hoover was to call it, seemed to prove the correctness of Jesse Fell's dream for the town of Normal so many years earlier. Where Bloomington faced the shuttering of its hometown brewery and the closing of dozens of saloons, Normal carried on business as usual. All that changed dramatically in late 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, ending Prohibition once and for all. Letting Americans once again drink to their heart's content had been an important plank of the Democratic Party platform of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal. Now, shortly after the end of Prohibition, Illinois' new Democratic Attorney General, Otto Kerner, ruled that Normal's anti-alcohol charter was unconstitutional. Normal, he said, must cease refusing to allow persons from selling liquor within town limits, and he ordered the town council to find ways to allow its citizens to purchase as much alcohol as they wished, whatever they wanted it. One could almost sense Jesse Fell rolling over in his grave. For nearly a year, Normal was a different place to live. Though the town council tried to find a way to hold sales down, advertisements in the paper now offered places with various beer and wine at restaurants throughout the area. One which did was the new Shell Inn, located on South Main Street at the corner of Virginia Avenue. Opened by local businessman Gus Belt as an attachment to his gas station on that corner, the inn, night after night, welcomed residents to an all-you-can-eat catfish, or sometimes fried turtle, dinner, along with Blatt's Old Heidelberg beer, all for only 25 cents. In August of 1934, it also started offering steak hamburgers on Purity Ann buns, a name that ultimately they changed to the easily recognized steak burgers. Though it was to me many years before the Shell Inn became Steak and Shake, the die was cast. Now, whether the fried turtle attracted as many residents as did the free Blatt's beer is hard to know today, but the majority of the town's citizens were horrified at that prospect of beer and even stronger alcohol being so readily available in town. After a petition drive to get a dry amendment on the ballot, more than 2,600 persons rushed to the polls on March the 4th, 1935, to cast what was then the biggest vote ever in Normal's history. By a margin of more than 2-1, they reaffirmed Jesse Fell's wishes. And for the second time, officially, the town once again forbade alcohol purchases or consumption within the town limits. For the next 38 years, Normal remained that way. Not until 1973 did Fell's dream finally die in another generation's drive to, quote, make Normal an up-to-date community. Growing out of the Great Depression came two other significant events, one national, one local, but both important to the long-range future of Normal. Though the town had had a post office since 1861, it was almost always a fly-by-night operation. Door-to-door delivery didn't occur until the 20th century. Almost every few years, the offices were moved from one location to another, mostly in spaces hardly large enough to turn around in. With the coming of the New Deal, however, and its huge influx of public works projects, the town decided to ask the federal government to build it a permanent building. In 1933, after much persuasion, the government agreed. After an extended search, it settled on property where one of the last large homes on North Street stood. The home was razed and construction of a new post office started in 1934. It is, with its New Deal-inspired and funded murals, obviously still in use today. Perhaps even more important to the residents of the town was the creation of a public library. There had been several unsuccessful attempts throughout the years. A reading room, for instance, had been established in 1883, with a number of subscribers, but it had quickly died. 13 years later, the town tried again and also failed. But now in 1935, as part of, quote, welfare work, unquote, to aid the many persons in town who were unemployed, a request went out for books to be donated so that another so-called free reading room could be established. To everyone's surprise, hundreds of books, mostly popular fiction, were given. A small room was selected on the second floor of the normal State Bank building, and day after day, books were checked out regularly. Over the next few years, space for the books moved frequently from one side of North Street to the other and back again, but it soon was clear that the residents, working or not, at last wanted a library. In 1938, voters went to the polls and approved money to set up just such a place. By this time, the library held more than 7,000 books and 75 magazine subscriptions, and there was no turning back. In June of 1939, a full-time librarian was hired, and the library moved to what folks thought at the time would probably be its permanent location directly across North Street from the relatively new post office building. And of course, in 1937, Normal also got its first real movie theater. Motion pictures had been shown in Normal for several years in what had been the original First Christian Church building at the corner of Broadway and Ash Street, the later location of the town's Masonic Lodge, but it had closed in the early 1920s. Now, however, an ultra-modern theater was built, and Normalites found they no longer had to go into Bloomington to see the latest picture shows. It too still stands, refurbished and in its own way honored. Creating a permanent water supply was not so easy. On more than one occasion, voters had gone to the polls and again defeated the expansion of an inadequate system that Normal had created before the turn of the century. That finally changed, however, in December 1941, less than 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 19th, more than 85% of eligible electors went to the polls and by more than 3-1 voted to build a water softening and purifying plant. Good ideas, however, do not always yield immediate results. Because of the war, it was not until 1946 that the town was able to get the supplies it needed to build that new facility. In January 1948, it finally went online, offering the public clean, fresh water for the first time in the town's history. If Normal was changing, sometimes kicking and screaming as it did so, there had been several campaigns, for example, to, quote, pull Normal out of the mud in hopes that they would encourage voters to approve paving all the streets. They had all failed. Nothing pushed the town into the future more than the town-gown relationship it had with ISNU. The years which had started so promisingly when the state of Illinois decided to place its only public university in Normal had, by the era of the Second World War, soured badly. Both its most recent two long-term presidents, David Felmley and Raymond Fairchild, had committed themselves to making sure that ISNU's sole job would be to always train teachers for the state schools and nothing else. Both men insisted they did not want the school's students to receive bachelor's degrees because that might imply a broad-ranging educational background. So obsessed was Felmley with his single vision that before his death in 1930, he'd even started hiring as faculty many who had no more than a 2-year normal school education themselves, resulting in the university losing its accreditation. Though it still proudly displayed the name university in its title, ISNU had become little more than a weak junior college. Fairchild, to be sure, did move the school deeply into an area he called special education, helping to lead the way nationally in that area, but he too was adamant in stressing the teaching of teachers was to be the school's only goal. Many local residents came to accept that status quo, but there were many others who found the situation untenable. And that all changed with the return of thousands of veterans from the Second World War, who, thanks to the GI Bill, now flooded the university's classrooms. Though many were happy to study to be teachers, far more were not. Though all students at ISNU were required to take a pledge that they would teach once they graduated, many demanded change and a curriculum that would prepare them to enter any number of other professions besides education. Year after year, Rebellion grew until by the mid-1950s, the question of transforming the university had become a regular bone of contention. The same could be said for the town itself. Veterans who moved to the area found a totally inadequate place to live. The shopping was mediocre, and there were only 2 small, very unexciting restaurants in downtown. There was also certainly not enough places for them to live. ISNU had but 1 dormitory, Fell Hall, which had been built in 1918, and then for women only, and it hadn't been updated since. The need for rooming houses was paramount, but so too was the need for classrooms, big enough to hold the growing student body. The veterans had barely returned when, symbolically, something happened that opened the door to a new day at both school and community. After inspecting ISNU's Old Main, state engineers insisted that its iconic dome and the entire 3rd floor, which included the auditorium, which had hosted so many events throughout the years, needed to be demolished immediately. As students and townfolk milled around, the building was literally ripped apart. The same engineers that had condemned the upper section of Old Main allowed the first 2 floors to be occupied for more than a decade. The building's days were clearly numbered. Finally, in 1958, the last bricks of what had been the university's most iconic symbol were demolished and carted away. The Pantograph in 1861 had called Old Main, quote, the very best building of its kind in America and perhaps in the whole world. Its lifetime turned out to be less than 100 years. Change, whether one wanted it or not, seemed inevitable. In 1956, 1 year before the university's centennial year, the school trustees hired Dr. Robert Bone from the University of Illinois as its new president. A historian rather than a professional specialist in education, Bone could see the need for positive change. Though many of his older faculty, mostly females, who'd been unable to get hired at more traditional universities, despite the fact that in many cases they'd received high honors at those same schools, objected bitterly to any change in the curriculum. Bone took an open approach, which only served to encourage many of the younger faculty, often males, and students of all sorts to accelerate their drive for the end of Normal's educational exclusivity. By the beginning of the 1960s, the proverbial handwriting was on the wall. The state legislature finally acquiesced in the idea of changing ISNU's mission. On January the 1st, 1964, ISNU ceased to exist. In its place came Illinois State University at Normal, and eventually just ISU. Changing a name, though, was one thing. But of course, with new students, and more importantly, came a radically changed town. When Robert Bone came to ISNU, there had been 3,200 students on campus. 11 years later, on September the 1st, 1967, the day he officially left the office as president, almost 11,000 students were now enrolled. To accommodate them and the thousands more who were expected to enroll over the next few years, new buildings were shooting up everywhere. By 1967, predictions were that before the current growth spurt had concluded, there would eventually be more than 30,000 students on campus, and it would rival the University of Illinois in size. Hundreds of old homes in Normal, so the planners said, would have to be torn down so that the university could expand. Change was already underway, even before Dr. Bone had arrived on campus. Several new dormitories had now been built. A new administration building had been completed in 1950, and several classroom buildings were on the drawing boards. Now, to handle the thousands of faces that seemed to be coming without halt, the university began to transform the landscape that had been Jesse Fell's legacy. The last vestiges of Old Main came down in the center of campus at the same time that the huge Hamilton-Witten Hall complex was going up at the end of the property. It was completed in 1959, and right on its heels came the adjacent Atkin-Colby complex. Even they were, however, not enough. In 1963, the so-called Tri-Towers were begun on the other side of Main Street, and 2 years after that, the two 17-story Hewitt and Manchester dorms started rising from land that had previously been residential. Both were completed in 1967, just in time to watch it become necessary for Normal to condemn even more buildings in the original town so that a 10th student residence, the gigantic 28-story Watterson Towers, one of the largest in the world, could be started. It was not just Illinois State, though, that caught up in the drive for change that so enveloped Normal after the mid-1950s. In 1952, local boy Adlai Stevenson, a graduate of ISNU's University High School, and by then the governor of Illinois, was nominated by the National Democratic Party as its candidate for president of the United States. Though he lost overwhelmingly that November to General Dwight Eisenhower, the sleepy Twin Cities were besieged by reporters all over the country, anxious to see what, in essence, had made Stevenson the man he'd become. The stories they filed about the cities more than once painted the town in a new rosy light. Suddenly, businesses which for years had turned their backs on the area now began to relocate here. In 1953, for instance, the General Electric Company became the first large firm to relocate just east of Normal. 5 years later, the Illinois Farm Bureau, or as it was then more commonly called, the Illinois Agricultural Association, came too, relocating its Chicago-based offices to land on the periphery of Normal and bringing with it more than 750 new families. State Farm Insurance, though hardly new to the area, also started growing exponentially, bringing home, unquote, thousands of new employees to its central hub. In 1940, just before the outbreak of World War II, Normal's population had stood at 6,963. 20 years later, it had almost doubled to 13,357. And when a special census was conducted in 1967, the population had surged even more dramatically and now stood at 23,150, more than a 230% increase in barely 25 years. It was growth that showed no signs of stopping. New people required new homes, a commodity that neither Normal nor Bloomington had. Suddenly, just about every empty space of farmland was being instantly converted into housing developments with such fancy-sounding names as Pleasant Hills or Latier Estates. The old Maplewood Country Club grounds, now, thanks to real estate developer Mark Iliff, was transformed into hundreds of new homes in what he called, not too originally, Maplewood Heights. Every year, more and more previous empty farmland disappeared. Between 1954 and 1964, 1,635 new homes were built in Normal, and many more were on the way. Country roads, such as Vernon or Jersey Avenue, which in many cases had stopped abruptly at the beginning of cornfields, now were paved and extended far out into the countryside. In 1967, Normal was changing faster than its residents could have imagined a generation earlier. Residential districts, especially near to downtown, disappeared. Old landmarks, such as the First Methodist Church, which had stood on the corner of Ash and Church Streets, that is, College and Fell, since 1867, were now demolished. Even streets had their names of 100 years or more changed. Sudduth, Ash, and Mulberry, for example, despite more than 1,000 petitioners protesting the change, were now combined into the blandly named College Avenue. On the drawing boards were plans at the university for a new student union and a new library, both of which would require the razzing of even more homes. Local residents who had grown accustomed to the old Normal of their childhood were confronted by a change that in many cases was hard to abide. As one repairman wistfully said to my wife and me shortly after we arrived in Normal from Michigan State in 1969, "Normal used to be such a nice place until people like you started moving here." For old-time residents, perhaps sadly, there was to be in the coming year many more of us than there was of them. Unwedded to the past, we saw and wanted our vision of a new town in which to live and raise our families. In many cases, it was a world of difference from that of the Normalites who had born and grown up here. A time traveler, somehow transported from the mid-1850s or even the early 1860s to the fall of 1967, would have felt himself in more than just a time warp. The miles and miles of waving prairie grass that he might have seen in his time could now only be found in a small patch of land dozens of miles to the northwest. They had now been replaced by huge high-rise student dormitories or housing developments as far as the eye could see. Trains still came to the junction on their way to either Chicago or St. Louis, but they were few and far between, having long before being replaced by automobiles as the preferred mode of transportation. ISNU's Old Main, which for many years had dominated the landscape in all directions, was gone. Though technically the town of Normal still was true to Jesse Fell's original anti-alcohol, prohibitionist heritage, such ideas were also on the verge of change. Indeed, anyone desiring a drink had only to walk over Division Street into Bloomington to buy and not too surreptitiously transport as many bottles as he wished into dry Normal. If change is a constant, then Normal offers a grand example of such truism. By 1967, the town was literally on the verge of radical transformation. Every day, residents saw change occurring almost everywhere. What would be next? Like a number of modern-day Hollywood films, there's not one but two different answers to that question. The first is the easy one. Only time will tell, or some other similar cliche. But there's a far better answer, too. On October the 4th, here in this same room where we are this afternoon, a panel of a number of past and present local luminaries will discuss the historic developments of the town from 1967 through 1993. The following Sunday, on the 11th, another group of Normal stars will try in a second four-person panel to take the story right up to the present day. I hope you will all come and learn even more. Thank you. I will tell Mercy one thing. I'll be glad to try to answer questions if you have, but I do hope she can figure out where the air conditioning is for the next meeting. I need to lose weight, you can tell from my gut, but I didn't plan on losing it this way, having it all drop on the floor. So if she can find an air conditioner sometime, that would be a great thing.
We will do that. We were working on it earlier, but there is something that is not working. I do apologize for that. We do have time for a few questions, but for anyone who needs to sneak out before that, if you have a parking pass, go ahead and just use that at the bottom as you pull out. You can just stick it in the machine, and it will tell you that you can get out for free, so you don't really have to go to the machine. And then don't forget to stop by our table. But are there any questions that anyone would like to ask Dr. Holsinger before we depart for the day? I will do a Phil Donahue and walk over here to capture this.
I started college here in 1967, and one of the things that surprised me more than anything else, coming from Peoria, was the protests for open housing in 67.
That's right.
Which eventually, and maybe you'll talk about the next one, but how did that come about that they restricted where people could live?
Well, Mark would be, where'd Mark go to? He's hiding down here. He would be the better one to answer that question than I would, but I think basically, how do I say this? From almost the beginning of Normal, there was a strong, even before Normal, there was always a strong racial integrationist idea. As I said, even when people voted in favor of integrating the schools, there were others who voted against it. Horace Mann, for instance, that I mentioned earlier, didn't come because he quickly discovered there were so many people in the area that were pro-Southern, in favor of slavery, anti-black, that he felt uncomfortable coming to this area. That's way back. That's 1967, but I think the answer is part of that. There were many people as the school began to grow, and more, it was an insignificant number in comparison today, but more and more black students began to arrive, that many, I hate to say it this way, it sounds like we're all putting on our white sheets, but that many residents were really quite upset by having black people in town. So the question then was, I refuse to rent to you because your skin is the wrong color. And so the people who felt differently felt it very important to try to get an open housing platform that would say, you can't discriminate. As you said, in 1967, that thing I didn't mention, obviously one of the many, there was a real battle that went on for months in the newspapers, letters to the editor, on WJBC, and whatever, with people fighting on one side or the other. That they finally did get around to approving such a thing was very, very controversial even then, as you remember. I don't know, does that even begin to answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, well, they marched. They got this, from us, from other cities, they actually would have marches for open housing. And of course, the students rallied around, most students rallied around that, not just the black students, but also the white students. So eventually, I didn't remember exactly when it ended, but I know my first year. So by 68, it would have been passed, I think.
Well, getting slightly ahead of 1967, in 1970, when we had the quote unquote riots around the flagpole, that was in large part because of, or indirectly because of, black students on campus who wanted to honor Malcolm X and name the union in honor of Malcolm X and so forth. And that first evening, there were riots in downtown, people throwing rocks and bricks, whether black students throwing at whites or whites throwing at blacks, who knows, who cares? But the point was, even after 1967, even after there was an open house, there was still a great deal of bitterness toward this idea of true integration. I find that kind of sad, but what can I say? That's life, I guess.
And there will be a lecture specific to the history of race relations in Normal by Dr. Mark Wyman coming up in a couple weeks, 3 weeks. I need to look at the calendar, but we have a schedule out there. So one more question. Does anyone have one more question before we adjourn? Sure.
Original house still in town, 1853. I thought it was by the railroad tracks at one time. Do you know?
Yeah.
No, the original house built in Normal.
Is the first house ever built in Normal still here?
Well, by the track, that's I said the station master, that's the McCambridge house that was located right near, so he could walk across the street, as it were, though there was no street, but he'd walk across to help the trains when they came in and then go back home again. But yeah, that was the first house as such. And you said it was late 1853 when it was built.
And I don't believe that is still standing. That's not still standing, the house. No.
The depot has been burned down a couple times in the process too. So.
Well, we are at about our appointed hour, and everyone has been very patient and attentive, even given the heat. We appreciate that. If you have anything, I'm sure Dr. Holsinger would stick around for a minute.
Sure.
It is a bit cooler in the hallway. It's perfect environment for some shopping. Don't forget Christmas right around the corner. And we hope to see you at future lectures, and check our website for any updates. Thank you very much.